So this project really started with you, didn't it, Daniele? You were the man with the ideas.
Well, it did, in that I was here at BC in 2012 as a fellow at the Jesuit Institute with a project on the soundscape of early modern Catholicism. So starting to explore what it meant for Catholics to use sound and music in their community life and in their shared liturgical and non-liturgical experiences and practices and so on. And as I started discussing my ideas with Professor T. Frank Kennedy, who was the director of the Institute, and with Michael Noone, then the idea came of organizing some kind of public scholarly event to channel some of these ideas and to see how fellow researchers and other musicologists would respond and contribute to that.
So, I mean, when we came to choosing, I suppose, the people who would contribute to this project, I was keen to ask you to flesh out this idea you had of a soundscape and how much it is focused on music, and sound is a larger category than music. And you had some very interesting ideas, and not only some interesting ideas, but you were able to connect these with some larger movements that are happening within the humanities that are looking at sound and the way, well, cultures use sound. Could you help me a bit with that?
Well, there has been surely a sonic turn in the humanities, in history especially. So scholars have realized that for all the importance of visual culture, there's more than that going on in any culture, in any community. So historians have started to look into that and try to let the archives, give back their sounds. And so exploring the role of bells, for instance, in Catholic communities, exploring how shared experiences of sound, not only at the elite level of highly composed music, but in more everyday experiences like communal singing, like the role that the spoken voice or the sung voice has in the daily practices, the daily life of individuals and communities. So the so-called sound studies emerged as a new important field that cuts across different disciplines.
Sure, and one of the things that's so interesting about musicology is that for such a long time musicology and musicologists have looked at elite culture because so often it's interesting, but so often it's what survives. So the sources we have are manuscripts or prints, printed compositions by well-known composers that were often commissioned by wealthy or influential patrons who might be an institution, a church or a court or an aristocratic family. But of course we all have two ears. Everybody hears, and Catholicism at no point was the sole preserve of elites. So that you were opening up not only to musicology, but even much further than that, the whole question of what are the ways in which sound, including music, was articulated to define Catholic practice and Catholic identity. And of course, this is still a very, very large category, because we then needed to look at what was the chronological period that interested us and what was the geographical region that interested us. So there was a lot of then refining the ideas.
The problem of the chronological framework is an interesting one, because there's been a growing dissatisfaction, I think, in our discipline with the old categories borrowed by art history, like, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Baroque, with strong divisions between them. These are good maybe for, teaching students or manual level. But when it comes to really understanding what was going on, I think we have to resort to a longue durée perspective, as the French school used to say. So to look at longer structures developing across our old labels and divisions. So when I kind of discovered what historians like John O'Malley, so Jesuit historian John O'Malley, was doing in proposing this label, this new category of early modern Catholicism, I thought, well, this is it. This is what we need to start exploring these phenomena, starting maybe from the 15th century and then going on. And gradually I discovered that really this longue durée lasts for centuries. So we had to look into the 18th century, if not maybe into the 19th, and so on. So this helped a lot to frame this discussion without those awkward borders of stylistic periodization, precisely for the reason that certain of these categories, certain of these phenomena we are looking into, do not belong to any stylistic periodization per se, but cut across these.
I thought we were incredibly lucky too to be able to count on John O'Malley, who has written a really splendid initial essay that really takes these historiographical problems and places them in quite a new light. He takes us through the historiographical categories of Reformation, of Counter-Reformation, of Catholic Reformation, and of course the Jesuits were an absolute key part of this, and nobody really understands the first centuries of the Jesuit order better than John. And that gave us a very exciting springboard from which to jump and from which to give a kind of an overarching, unifying vision and lens. But it's a very generous kind of lens. Rather than limiting us, it was something that opened up both geographical and chronological possibilities. But of course, it was John O'Malley who'd already worked with T. Frank Kennedy on a number of other projects that had to do with the Jesuits, but the intersection of faith and culture writ large, that opened up for us the possibility of being able to hand-pick an international team of scholars. And I think from the word go, we were keen to make sure that this wasn't going to be yet another Anglo-transatlantic access, that we wanted to involve people whose first language wasn't English and people whose formation wasn't necessarily in an English-speaking country. And in the end, we had a representative sampling of scholars from a variety of backgrounds. Of course, we would have wanted more, but that would have meant several more volumes. And it also would have made the rather intimate circumstances of this conference much less possible.
We had a very good response from the scholars we invited, because this perspective of listening to early modern Catholicism, I think, stimulated interest in scholars who had been doing groundbreaking work on some of the subjects we were interested in, and found here the matrix, the framework into which to fit their own work. So this was very interesting. And I was especially happy to have among us an ethnomusicologist from Italy, Ignazio Macchiarella, who is doing historical ethnomusicology and somehow bridging the gap between these past phenomena, these phenomena belonging to the early modern era, and what still in certain communities in the Mediterranean, in the Italian islands and in Corsica as well, what is still happening or has been happening until very recently in those communities, which gives us a fascinating perspective again on the longue durée of these phenomena and the long-lasting impact of things started in the early modern era.
Yeah, and that's a very, very interesting example, because there you have a continuing practice of highly, at a very high level, of an improvisatory practice that is specific to certain locations in Sicily, that clearly relates to practices that we have documentary evidence about from as early as the 15th and 16th century, but because of its very nature, being an improvisation, it is lost at the very moment that the performance has been finished. Yet we have a continuing practice here that offers us insights that simply can't be gained in any other way. And that was really fascinating. But it was also fascinating because, as you mentioned, we have so many disciplinary categories, and there's this thing called ethnomusicology and this thing called musicology, as if somehow you can use different methods to apply to different kinds of music. And in a way we're stuck with those categories, and in a way we're stuck with those kinds of trainings. But we were constantly wanting to reach past those barriers and to make those barriers more and more porous. And at the moment I'm talking about musicology and ethnomusicology, but I think we were very aware too that those of us who work with music, we tend to speak to each other, and I think we forget how the larger world of historians, cultural historians, sees us as our own kind of ghetto. And so we were trying to find ways in which we could reach beyond the confines of our own discipline and its terminology, and to use our terminology rather than something that puts up barriers, something that actually lowers them. And it's easy to say something like that, but it's not so easy to do.
This is a very important aspect of this project right from the start. The idea of trying to talk to people in other disciplines, sharing with them what we can learn about early modern Catholicism from our perspective as musicologists. So that's why we choose as a subtitle, Perspectives from Musicology. Because this is the point. I was amazed reading the contributions by the people we invited, and of course their books they had published before, how much we can learn by listening to the sounds and to the music of this period. But it is not a merely musicological understanding that we gain, but something more. And I think it's worth sharing that with scholars from other backgrounds and other disciplines to facilitate a discussion that promises to be very fruitful. It is true that not many other scholars read what musicologists normally write, and we should help empowering musicologists to be listened to and maybe encourage other scholars to read more what musicologists write. And I think from this discussion we will have interesting results in the future, and with this book we wanted to open a path into this direction.
I think we forget just how within our own disciplines how we so often neglect speaking to a wider audience. But this was one of the great things about the discussions we had with T. Frank Kennedy, because when T. Frank Kennedy was the director of the Jesuit Institute, and he decided that this was a great project, one of the things that T. Frank kept talking about was, one, he was interested in the intersection of faith and culture, but he was also interested in ways of knowing, ways of seeing, ways of hearing. He was constantly saying we live in a world where the discourse of words is a very strong one, but there are other discourses and ways of understanding. One of them is the discourse of gesture, performance, theatre, ballet, dance. Another is the discourse of images. We live in a world that is saturated with images. And, of course, the Jesuits, right from the Baroque period, had a very, very strong sense about the ways in which things that could not be expressed in words could be learned and understood through images. And, of course, there was also the discourse of sound. Sound organised, as it is in musical practice, organised in an improvisatory way or in an inherited way, or by very highly trained specialists who were either composers, arrangers or performers, who chose the language of sound and music as their preferred discourse for understanding the world. And when we were, of course, delighted to be able to have with N.T. Frank somebody who was so welcoming to such an ample vision of the world of sound. But we were also lucky to be able to rely on a number of contributors who brought to our ideas very specific instances that we really hadn't foreseen. So you have a really interesting study by Andrew Keachie, for example, about how the Jesuit English College of St. Albans in Valladolid in Spain, at a period when Spain and England were at war, you have a foreign seminary. It was run by the Jesuits, but it wasn't to train Jesuits, and how they would use music and musical celebrations to engage with the local Spanish community at a level of shared Catholicism, but at a point when their national identity was clearly the identity of people who were at war, and they were using sound as a way to negotiate this. I mean, they were fellows with the Spaniards in that they were Catholics, but they were English. They were the enemies of the Spaniards. And that was only one example. Colin Reardon's study of the music of female cloistered communities is an absolutely fascinating one, because, still any kind of general history of music you'll find that you'll be lucky if you can find a footnote that refers to any kind of women making music, let alone cloistered women using music. But these were places that were really, truly alive with very specific and fascinating series of musical practices that you simply can't categorize as being used for pietistic purposes or for worship purposes. Of course, they were used for those purposes, but they were used for other purposes as well. So I think that we were very, very lucky to be able to bounce off that rather ample springboard of the intersection of faith and culture, but also the freedom to be able to look at very specific individual circumstances. And there are some other individual circumstances too that are part of this volume, aren't there?
Sure. For instance, we have some studies on Rome as, the capital of early modern Catholicism, of course. And some of these studies really open new perspectives. For instance, when Margaret Murada studies cantatas, penitential cantatas in early Baroque Rome, with this angle of looking at the devotional and spiritual practices into which these cantatas, the performances of these cantatas were embedded. Then, by doing this, we gain a new insight into these cantatas, which are, of course, considered normally as just as part of an immense and almost unexplored repertory that hardly speaks to us nowadays. But when you start from the exercises of St. Ignatius, and when you start from other shared elements of a devotional culture, of a spirituality, then you get a new insight that combines very well with the insight gained from music analysis to disclose the real, I hope can say that, or the meaning of those works for the communities for which they were composed and performed. So definitely to have this broader perspective helps gain better insights into this repertory. It was definitely a multimedia culture to an extent that maybe nowadays we not necessarily easily imagine. But they were constantly working with sounds, with music, with images, and with combinations of these elements, as it happens also in drama or any kind of musical or non-musical theater of the time, to convey meanings, to construct identities, and so on. So we really have to put the pieces together to start understanding better how these shared experiences, how this sense of community, sense of belonging worked. And a place to look at is confessionally divided or confessionally debated areas of Europe. There is an interesting study in the book by Alex Fischer exploring the processional culture of those lands in the Habsburg Empire, which were border lands between Catholicism and other confessions, and the role that processions and their music and their appearance played in negotiating this at times conflictual or at times more dialogic relationship between the different communities. So once again, we look at sounds, we listen to sounds, but we are also exploring broader issues, and these topics about interconfessional, transconfessional encounters are now becoming very much topical across these disciplines. So this is also quite interesting. And yeah.
No, it's fascinating, especially with this period. And well, I suppose we began thinking, well, we'll look at from 1450 to about 1650. It's 200 years. This is still a huge amount of time. As it turned out, most of our studies fitted into a more reduced chronological span, which, I mean, for argument's sake, we can speak very generally about, say, 1550 to 1650, say. But there was, when you were talking about Fischer's article, I think one of the things about the volume, one of the things we were very aware of, is that these categories like confessional, like Catholic, like Protestant, like Orthodox, like unorthodox, the early modern period, not just in Europe, but certainly in Central Europe, was one of enormous diversity, enormous plurality. And within a category like Catholicism, it itself was an enormously pluralistic kind of set of. It was like a huge family with all kinds of factions within it, and those factions were often at war with each other, at war about their practices, about their beliefs, about their senses of identity. And, you know, one of the articles by Tess Knighton is very interesting because we have many, many official documents about what people should believe. We have many documents about what people should be taught, doctrinal documents, catechisms, etc. But we have much less information about what people really did believe. And Tess Knighton's article is fascinating. She's spent years in archives in Barcelona looking at the last wills and testaments of an entire cross-section of Barcelonan people. And there is probably no other point in life than when you are actually in the privacy of your own home, writing your last will and testament, facing your ultimate death, when you really decide what's important and what isn't. And of course, one of the things that's so interesting about that is the way that individuals, when they're writing their last will and testament, will define the kinds of things that they want to happen to accompany their body through its last days on earth and its transition into the next life, and how often parts of those rituals themselves involved musicians, instrumental music, specific pieces of music, bells, the participation of people, members of the clergy, but others. And I have to say that many of these testaments too, they showed all kinds of unorthodox beliefs that were part and parcel of a kind of popular piety, a popular understanding of doctrine.
I think readers will be surprised by the diversity of documents and methods that you find employed by the different contributors in our book. You know, lay readers may think that musicologists only permanently look at scores and music and manuscripts of music, but here we have scholars digging into archives which preserve the last wills of people in Barcelona, as well as to the scores of cantatas in Rome, but also all sorts of documents from catechism, letters by missionaries, judicial documents. So really our contributors are looking at many different sources of information to try to reconstruct this soundscape. And it's also important what you were mentioning before, that we don't have a single monolithic culture, as we don't have a single monolithic Catholicism. So I like to speak of the sonic cultures that developed within the matrix of early modern Catholicism. This is also something very important to me, because we have to trace the shared aspects of this, which remained true from Italy to the transatlantic missions, and from recusant England to other locales. But there are also very specific aspects of these families, of these subcultures, if you want, of early modern Catholicism that we have also to precisely identify, to say something meaningful about this soundscape that we aim to reconstruct.
For me, certainly one of the most fascinating contributions was the one made by Egberto Bermúdez. You just mentioned missionary activities, and of course when we're talking about this period, we're talking about, it's hard to imagine really from the 21st century what it must have been like as one after another galleon returned from the so-called New World with these extraordinary tales of completely new biospheres, new flora, new fauna, new food, new ethnicities, new languages, different kinds of topographies, new unimaginable new worlds. And of course they went initially, it wasn't with any high ideals about winning souls for God or even about discovering anything new in the world. It was about trade. It was about opening up new trade routes. But of course they would come back, galleons loaded with wealth, but also with a wealth of expanding ideas, that there is the human imagination, the natural world is so much bigger than any European had been able to imagine before. Of course, this begins the great age of missionary activities, and there's a lot of work that's done then and subsequently about what is being a mission all about. Where in the gospel does it tell us exactly what missus, being sent, really means? And especially amongst the Jesuits, but the Franciscans and the Dominicans as well, there is an enormous amount of reflection, of huge mistakes being made, of redefining what that activity is. And one of the great things about Bermúdez study here, which narrows us down to the period 1525 to 1575, it's still a 50-year period over a vast geographical region. He looks at many sources that are autochthonous to the New World. He looks back at the missionaries. He looks back at the Spanish and the Portuguese explorers, the conquistadores, the politicians, and the missionaries. And we find once again that the ways in which different peoples interact is really a very, very complex matrix of misunderstandings, of temporary alliances, of new ways of defining, new ways of understanding what the human experience is about. There are some tragedies and there are some extraordinary successes. And we know that Egberto has an enormous amount of material, and he was able to distill a really valuable part of this material that he's collected over the years for our book, and I think it's really enhanced its value.
Until recently, scholarship has looked into missionary areas as detached from the European background. what is, I think, emerging right now is that we have to keep looking at the two areas at the same time. So to understand what the background of missionary was, and this is what Egberto is doing, tracing the intellectual and spiritual background of missionaries before becoming missionaries, so during their formation in Europe, and even compare the methods that were being employed by missionaries, including those regarding music, so the use of songs and sounds and bells, in Europe and in the missions. And only by comparing these, we gain a better access to the whole idea of mission in the early modern era that involved not only going to Latin America or Asia or elsewhere, but reaching out to all in need of being missionized, so to speak, even in rural areas of Europe, from southern Italy to Bohemia to Corsica to Spain and northern France, etc. And the Jesuits, together with the Franciscans, were at the forefront in this enterprise. And we have many interesting instances of what we might call collaboration at a distance between missionaries in those areas of Europe and missionaries there, with exchanges, with letters. Think of Francis Xavier writing back from his experiences in Asia, and what these letters meant to all the young Jesuits that were being trained for future missions, etc. And this is so true also for music, when we realized, for instance, that Francis Xavier was using songs and chanted formulas for teaching the catechism in these languages that, of course, were very hard to master for a European, for the first comers there, and how those methods then, validated by Xavier's experience, became then the standard way of doing that for other missionaries in the following decades and centuries.
Another aspect of the collected articles here is the way that we were looking at the kinds of environments that are not usually the subject of musicological investigation, or haven't been perhaps the first ones that people go to. So Daniele's article is a very interesting one about how the catechism and the doctrines were actually taught, the sort of pedagogical means and the use of music and sounds and repetition that were used. There's a fabulous article by Noel O'Regan on confraternities. Confraternities are very important lay organizations within the church. They're not exactly within the church. They have a kind of a territory that's partly within and partly in competition to the church. They served the kind of, well, in some ways, they were the prototypes of trade unions. They were the prototypes of guilds. They were also places that were the prototypes of the modern welfare state. Members of a confraternity would look after each other. When a member died, they would look after a family or a widow. But they would articulate this through a set of practices that were in some sense social, in another sense pietistic, and they always involved some kind of sound or musical articulation of that kind of relationship. So there's a very interesting article of Noel O'Regan's precisely on confraternities, still a kind of centre for faith practice and music practice that tends to be overlooked by modern scholars. There are also a few other areas like that we were lucky enough to have covered in the volume.
We have an article by Xavier Bizarro, a French scholar, who has been looking into the role played by music and singing in French parochial schools, especially so in villages in the French countryside in the early modern era. And it is fascinating to learn about the remarkable role that music and singing played there. For instance, with school children involved in, so taking part by singing at funerals or other community events. And these formed the basis for a training of lay men in plain chant, so that then they could contribute to the Sunday liturgies in the parish church and help the parish priest sing the chants, because of course in a parish, in a parochial situation in the countryside, you don't have enough singers, enough religious singers, enough priests to perform all that is needed. So this is a remarkable example of the involvement of laity via sound, via singing in liturgy, which is something that we normally do not necessarily associate with early modern Catholicism. We think that it is only by the reforms of the 20th century, the liturgical reforms of the 20th century, that we have achieved some degree of active participation, participatio actuosa, on the side of the faithful. Instead, we are discovering that many seeds of these were very much part of the community life of early modern Catholics, which is, I think, quite thought-provoking, not only in merely, historical erudition, but also in terms of other ways of thinking at Catholicism at large.
And it's another reminder of just how important oral traditions are, and how oral traditions are the things that so often become lost. When we're studying documents, we study documents, and we have all kinds of documents. We have maps, we have statues, we have portraits, we have paintings, we have all kinds of printed and manuscript documents. And inevitably we tend to privilege those because they give us access that we simply do not have to oral traditions. Yet oral traditions are precisely the kinds of things that are inhering in the idea of listening, in the idea of using the ability to hear and to make sound. And one of the articles that didn't make it into the volume was a splendid contribution to the conference that was made by Andrew Dell'Antonio, who really interrogated the first word that we use in our title here, this idea of listening. We live in a world where sound is everywhere, and the idea of hearing, of a passive kind of hearing, is really part of our daily experience. Concomitantly, the very active, concentrated business of listening is something that we've lost in our modern society, and something that was part and parcel of meditative states, reflective states. And this reminds us, by the way, of Ignatius's spiritual exercises too. Sometimes we forget how an altered state of heightened concentration is so often accompanied by a very active deciding what you listen to and how you listen to it. And although Andrew's article didn't make it into the volume, it really gave us a splendid framework for thinking past this word that we so often take for granted, listening. What actually is listening? What actually takes place when an individual or a community listens actively and concentratedly?
And in a book titled Listening to Early Modern Catholicism, we couldn't do without something to listen to. So we were able, thanks to the publisher, to include some music examples that can be played from the internet, and they illustrate some of our case studies. And I think this is a very promising thing for future studies, and it's already being done by, of course, other books. But it's important because it's hard to otherwise to reconstruct the soundscape and put it, between the cover and the back cover of a book without any taste of it. So we were very happy to be able to include some music examples. And another thing I wanted to mention is, again, to go back to the idea of the everyday experience of Catholic communities and individuals. So if you ask someone to mention, so how they would, I recap. So if you ask someone about the music of early modern Catholicism. They would probably mention Palestrina, they would probably mention, I don't know, Charpentier, Monteverdi, other big names. But we have to realize that these were exceptional experiences offered not necessarily to everybody and not every single day of the year. So this is another way to look at the problem of elite versus vaster, more easily accessible experiences. So we wanted to have the whole picture there. So, and the background that allows Palestrina or Monteverdi to exist, but as part of a sort of continuum, as part of a complex and stratified culture and society. So this is, I think, another defining aspect of what we are trying to do with this book.
And finally, I think we need to say that it was enormously exciting and invigorating and stimulating for us to work as a trio at a time when a number of things were happening. Daniele moved back to Italy from his 2 years here in Boston. T. Frank Kennedy, who was the director of the Jesuit Institute, was offered and accepted a research position at the University of Oxford. So while we were in the early processes of editing, we were dealing with each other in this kind of transatlantic two-time zone manner. And during this period, T. Frank Kennedy, although he didn't realize it at the time, was becoming more and more sick. And it turned out that he had pancreatic cancer. And unfortunately, T. Frank died without seeing this book in its final form. However, he was part of every single aspect of it until almost at the end. And it was at that stage that we really thought the most obvious thing we could do is dedicate the book to his memory. And we've published what we think is a rather splendid portrait of T. Frank right at the beginning there. We can't really think of, at least for ourselves, a better tribute to his participation in this project than to dedicate it to his memory. And in many ways, we want to keep this memory alive. We found it a very stimulating one, and we know that the scholars who came from the various parts of the world for this project are looking for the next collaboration. And they might not be thinking of T. Frank, but we certainly will be thinking of T. Frank as we move forward with our own research careers.
I do hope that Boston College will be able to go on with this tradition and host further events and, foster this kind of research that has so much to disclose about the history and maybe even the present of Catholicism.